Okay, so today we are going to be writing some Android. So this video assumes that you've already been through parts 1, 2, and 3 of the Your First Kotlin Android App Ray Wenderlich tutorial. So you've already done the Getting Started section, the basics, and activities. So you're at this point where you have just finished the conclusion of activities and you have not gone on to debugging yet. So that's the point that we're at in our application, and we can take a look here at what our application looks like at the moment. We have a button that says tap me, a certain amount of time remaining, and we have to try to tap the button as many times as we can before the timer goes out. Now, the tutorial set this to 60 seconds, but I've set it to 5 seconds in this case so that I have a faster turnaround time while I'm checking out what my application can do. So that's the point that we're at right now. The thing about this app is that so far we have not included any tests. And so in this series of videos, we will be writing some tests for this application, which is going to introduce us to a whole bunch of concepts in Android that it's important for you to know. So far, you've learned a little bit about Android Studio. You've also learned about how to do a layout on Android. You've learned about how to hook up items in the layout to the code, and you've learned about how to manipulate values in the code to display different things on screen. That's fantastic. And now we're going to take a look under the hood to learn a little bit more about how Android works and some of the tools available at our disposal to make it work for us. So I have here my application open in Android Studio. We're going to be going through several concepts in these videos with several different pieces of the Android framework as well as this editor. The editor I'm in is called Android Studio, and you've used it throughout the tutorials so far. There are a couple of things that we need to make sure are set a certain way in our studio before we move on. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see that we can set up the way that our project appears to be a number of different things. Right now, I have it set to Android, which arranges my file in a certain way, my files in a certain way. I want to set the way that my files are displayed to project instead of Android. So this is where you want to be. And you'll know that you're there when you have Time Fighter up at the top. You have a Gradle dot directory at the top level, and then you have app right here. And inside of app, you have a number of things, namely source, which has test, Android test, and main inside it. Inside of main Java, you have, after your namespace, main activity. And if we look at that main activity, we can see the code that we've already written for these portions of the tutorial. Let's learn a little bit about how this is working. So in Android, you can write a lot of things out of the box with the Android framework, but the Android framework is made up of components that you can exclude or exclude from your application depending on what you need to do with it. This is the case with any framework. We see the same thing in iOS or with Rails or with Django or with any major framework where we can depend on other code. We need a way to manage those dependencies inside of any relatively complex application. And there are a couple of ways that we can do that in Android. There are two chief dependency management systems for Android. One of them is called Maven, and one of them is called Gradle. This project is using Gradle. There are two Gradle files that I want to make you aware of right now. The first one is your top level build.gradle, which is at the level of your Time Fighter project. The other is your app level build.gradle. So let's take a look at these files and talk about what they do. This is your project level build.gradle, and it contains settings that are going to apply to every module in your project. You'll see that it includes things like what version of Gradle you're using right now, as well as where you are fetching repositories from so that you can use those inside of your code. So, um, for example, here on lines 21 and 22, what I see is that the main repositories that I'm pulling code from are Google and then JCenter. That means that any dependencies that I ask for in this project, Gradle is going to look for them at the Google dependency system first. And after that, if there are any that it can't find, then it will move on to JCenter. Okay, so generally you won't be putting that much stuff inside of your project level build.gradle. Generally, when you have particular dependencies that you want to use for your application, you're going to include those in your app level build.gradle. I'll hit Command Shift O here to open, and then I'll type in BUI build.gradle. I see two here, one at the root of the project right there, and one at the app level. That's the one I'm going to click on with Enter. One quick note about the editor before we move on. Android Studio is a fork of the JetBrains family of editors, the most well-known of those being IntelliJ, which is typically used for Java development. The IDE has a large range of key bindings that you can use to get things done more quickly as you're trying to build and refactor your code. Those key bindings are not necessarily obvious to you as I am typing them into the editor, so I'm going to do my best to say them out loud as I type them. In addition, I have turned on a feature inside of my Android Studio IDE called Presentation Assistant. The way that Presentation Assistant works is that each time I type in a key binding, it's going to show you that key binding on the bottom of the screen in a green bubble. So when I hit Command Shift O, it says navigate to file via Command Shift O. It also tells you what it would be on a Windows machine. So in this case, I've got Shift Control N for Windows or a Linux machine. So hopefully there will be two ways for you to see which key bindings I'm using. These key bindings are extremely valuable for getting through the code more efficiently, and the key bindings are largely the same on JetBrains editors for whatever language you're using. So RubyMine for Ruby or PyCharm for Python. But even if you're not into the JetBrains editor specifically, suppose that you really, really like Eclipse, or suppose that you're a big fan of VS Code, or you're working in Xcode, no matter which integrated development environment you're using, it is worth the investment to learn the key bindings for that development environment so that you can move more naturally as you're trying to work with your code. Okay, so like I said, we're looking at our build.gradle at the app level now. And here we're going to see a couple of things. So you can see I have the SDK version right there, the version of Android that I'm targeting, that I'm compiling to, and that's 28 in this case. Then I have some default config, the application ID, the minimum SDK version that you can run this application on, my target SDK version, which version code I have, which name I want. So this stuff is all generated automatically for me when I build this project. And there are a number of places in the project that we can edit these. Most notably, if I go to Command semicolon, I can change things in the project structure here. Okay, so additionally, I could manually edit these things if I wanted to. All right, so let's come down here past the Android block to the dependencies block. This is where we can include additional dependencies for what we want to add into our application. You'll see that a couple of things are added here by default. Implementation dependencies are things that will be used in the running of our application on a device. Test implementation things are things that we might use in our unit tests. Android test implementations are things that we might use in our UI tests. And those are going to appear in Android test over here in the source. So once more, implementation, you can think about it applying to main. Test implementation, you can think about it applying to test. And Android test implementation, you can think about it applying to Android test. Now, I like to separate these each with spaces like this to make things a little bit more legible for me when I'm trying to find stuff. That's a cosmetic change, but we'll be making more substantial changes as we start writing our tests in the next video.